In 1985, a notorious hitman walked out of his Sydney apartment, got into a police car, and vanished without a trace. His name was Chris Flannery, and he charged $50,000 per kill. This was the beginning of Australia's most mysterious cold case. What happened in those final moments? The official story claims he simply disappeared, but witness accounts tell a different tale. One that involves corrupt police officers, organized crime bosses, and a web of silence that has lasted nearly 4 decades. Brunswick, 1948. A small boy stands in the doorway of a weatherboard house, watching his father stumble down the street one last time. Chris Flannery would never see his alcoholic father again, leaving his mother to work multiple jobs in Melbourne's roughest neighborhood just to keep food on the table. This moment marked the beginning of his tragic transformation. The neighborhood was a breeding ground for violence and crime, where local gangs ruled the corners. Chris quickly gained a reputation as the kid who wouldn't back down, no matter how big his opponent. By 12, he was running with older boys, participating in petty theft and street fights. His mother's pleas fell on deaf ears as he chased quick money and street respect. At 14, Flannery crossed a line that would change his life forever. His first criminal conviction came after a brutal assault on a local shopkeeper who'd accused him of stealing. Instead of showing remorse, Chris smiled throughout his court appearance. The judge, troubled by his behavior, sentenced him to Morning Star Reformatory School. Morning Star would transform this troubled teen into something far more dangerous. Behind its stone walls, guards employed systematic torture under the guise of discipline. Flannery became their primary target, his defiant attitude drawing special attention. In response, he orchestrated an act of rebellion that became legendary, convincing an older inmate to tattoo a massive crucifix across his back. The crude ink job was excruciating, but it served its purpose. The guards couldn't strike him there anymore without damaging their handiwork. Each punishment only hardened his resolve. While other boys crumbled, Flannery emerged stronger, organizing other inmates and manipulating the system to his advantage. The reform school's attempts to rehabilitate him backfired spectacularly. By 19, his escalating violent behavior landed him in Melbourne's notorious Pentridge prison. As he walked through those gates, the guards whispered warnings about the new arrival. But they didn't realize that their warnings were too late. Morning Star had already done its work. The scared young boy who'd watched his father walk away was long gone. In his place stood a young man who'd learned that violence was the only language the world understood. As he was processed into Pentridge's intake unit, a prison psychologist noted his disturbing lack of empathy and potential for extreme violence. Behind those bluestone walls, in the infamous H Division, Chris Flannery was about to receive an education in brutality that would transform him into Australia's most feared hitman. Those bluestone walls held secrets darker than anyone could imagine. Inside H Division, guards wielded absolute power, turning daily life into an endless cycle of physical and psychological torture. When they encountered Chris Flannery's defiant attitude, they saw it as a personal challenge they needed to crush. Inside this concrete fortress, new arrivals faced brutal beating sessions that could last for hours. The guards operated without oversight or restraint, making every day a fresh torment for the inmates. But Flannery refused to submit to their authority. In a shocking act of rebellion, he stripped completely naked and covered himself in his own waste, making it impossible for the guards to handle him. When that didn't stop the beatings, he launched a hunger strike that lasted 28 days. His deteriorating condition and the publicity it generated forced authorities to launch a parliamentary inquiry into conditions within H Division. His brother, Michael Flannery, a respected Melbourne lawyer, helped expose these abuses. He testified about the systematic torture, the arbitrary punishments, and the culture of violence that permeated every corner of the facility. The inquiry revealed horrifying details: inmates being forced to run gauntlets of baton-wielding guards, random midnight beatings, and psychological warfare designed to break even the strongest spirits. But rather than breaking under the pressure, Flannery was studying. Every punch thrown by a guard, every psychological tactic they employed, he absorbed it all. Prison psychologists noted with growing alarm his exceptional ability to compartmentalize violence and his complete absence of normal emotional responses. One report warned that he was developing advanced sociopathic tendencies that could make him extremely dangerous if released. The guards became his unwitting teachers in the art of brutality. They showed him how to inflict maximum pain with minimum effort, how to use fear as a weapon, and how to break someone's spirit through calculated violence. These lessons in brutality would later make him Australia's most feared hitman. As the parliamentary inquiry dragged on, conditions in H Division barely improved. Flannery spent 3 years in this concrete hell, emerging in 1972 as something entirely new. The young criminal who entered Pentridge was gone. In his place stood a man who had mastered the very techniques of brutality that were meant to subdue him. The system had tried to break Chris Flannery. Instead, they created something far more dangerous. As he walked out of Pentridge's gates, he carried with him the scars of his imprisonment and a deadly education in violence that would soon terrorize Australia's criminal underworld. The guards had transformed him, just not as they'd intended. Freedom exposed Flannery's stark limitations as a criminal in Australia's underworld. Despite his prison education, he proved remarkably inept at armed robbery, with each attempt ending in humiliating failure. These disasters would eventually drive him toward a far more sinister path that would terrorize the entire country. His robbery attempts read like a comedy of errors. Once, he tripped over his own feet during an escape, scattering stolen money in front of witnesses. In Perth, his getaway car ran out of fuel just blocks from the bank he'd robbed. Each failure only fueled his determination to succeed in crime. Seeking stability, Flannery briefly worked at an upscale men's clothing store in Melbourne. There, he developed his signature taste for Italian designer suits and expensive cologne. But after 2 months, he returned to crime, robbing the same store that employed him. He even paused during the robbery to try on a jacket, as his former boss would later tell police. The defining moment came at Sydney's Central Station. Detective Roger Rogerson and his team had been monitoring Flannery after his string of failed robberies across New South Wales. When Flannery spotted the surveillance team during morning rush hour, he drew his weapon, transforming the busy station into chaos. Trapped between platforms 18 and 19, Flannery unleashed a level of violence that previewed his future notoriety. He charged at the police officers, firing indiscriminately with complete disregard for his safety. It took 6 officers to subdue him, and even then, he fought with such intensity that several needed medical attention. During the arrest, Flannery displayed a shocking savagery that rattled even veteran officers. He seemed to embrace the violence, laughing as police struggled to contain him. One detective called it the most savage resistance arrest in his 20-year career. Back in prison, Flannery made a decision that would alter Australia's criminal landscape forever. In a prison yard conversation with fellow inmate Alan Williams, he announced his new career plan. "I'm done with this amateur stuff. From now on, I'm going to kill people for a living." Williams thought it was a joke until he saw Flannery's cold, determined expression. That conversation marked the emergence of Mr. Rent-a-Kill, Australia's first professional hitman for hire. Flannery had discovered his true criminal calling. The failed robber was about to become the most feared assassin in the country's history. While Melbourne's criminal underworld was filled with tough guys and empty threats, Flannery distinguished himself with a revolutionary business approach, a professional contract killing service with a strict fixed rate payable in advance. After years of failed robberies, he had found his true calling in methodical, calculating murder. His reputation spread quickly through criminal networks as someone who delivered results with cold efficiency. His transformation from bungling thief to feared hitman was cemented with the contract on Melbourne solicitor Roger Wilson. Wilson had made dangerous enemies through his work with police informants, and his elimination would showcase Flannery's trademark precision. Dressed in a police uniform, Flannery approached Wilson outside his suburban home, claiming he needed to discuss a case. The solicitor, accustomed to working with law enforcement, willingly entered the vehicle. By the time Wilson realized his fatal mistake, they were deep in the woods outside Melbourne. What followed demonstrated Flannery's calculated methodology. He systematically wore his target down before executing him with 2 precise shots. The body was buried in the forest, but increasing police activity forced Flannery to relocate it to a site that remains undiscovered despite extensive searches. Wilson's disappearance triggered a major investigation, but potential witnesses had an unsettling habit of vanishing before they could testify. The Wilson murder established Flannery as Melbourne's premier contract killer. Unlike his earlier chaotic robbery attempts, this new profession perfectly suited his methodical nature and prison-hardened instincts. Each successful hit enhanced his reputation, and Melbourne's underworld elite soon recognized that the former failed criminal had found his true expertise: precise, professional elimination. Chris Flannery's home life reveals a man living in perfect balance between 2 extreme worlds. In their suburban home, he transformed into a devoted family man, pushing his adopted child on playground swings and never missing family dinner, even after the deadliest assignments. His marriage to Kathleen Egan in April 1978 marked an unexpected turning point. Fresh out of prison and already establishing himself as Australia's deadliest hitman, Flannery showed genuine dedication to his new family by adopting Kathleen's child from a previous relationship. Those who knew them witnessed his authentic commitment to domestic life. The feared hitman who made hardened criminals tremble had only one person who could strike fear into his own heart: his wife, Kathleen. "I've got to get home or she'll have my nuts," he'd tell associates when meetings ran late, betraying a mixture of respect and genuine fear for his wife's authority. Between violent assignments, Flannery immersed himself completely in family life, taking elaborate vacations that could stretch for weeks. He'd spend his days playing with his child and attending to domestic duties as if his darker profession didn't exist. But the police surveillance teams documenting his movements knew the truth, watching his seamless transitions between family man and executioner. Their relationship carried an intensity that fascinated observers. Kathleen proved far more than a passive witness to her husband's criminal career. She asked detailed questions about his activities and exercised considerable influence over his decisions. Police eventually suspected she played a significant role in coordinating his criminal enterprises. The surveillance team stationed outside their home witnessed his daily transformations. In the morning, he'd kiss his family goodbye like any suburban father. Hours later, he'd carry out a contract with cold precision. Then he'd return home, change clothes, and help with homework as if nothing had happened. Flannery mastered the art of compartmentalization between his roles as family man and contract killer. He applied the same meticulous attention whether planning an assassination or organizing a family birthday party. At the center stood Kathleen, the only person who truly understood both sides of Australia's most feared hitman, sharing a story that merged domestic devotion with criminal enterprise. Behind the carefully maintained facade of family man lay a predator who could switch from sharing tea with his targets to executing them in cold blood. The Basham murders would become one of the most shocking examples of his ruthless nature. August 13, 1982, started like any other day in suburban Sydney. Drug dealer Terence Basham and his partner Susan Smith welcomed Flannery into their home, completely unaware of his true intentions. He sat calmly with his victims, engaging in pleasant conversation over tea while knowing exactly how their afternoon would end. Without warning, Flannery drew his weapon and executed both Basham and Smith at point-blank range. The clinical precision of the killing showed his evolution into a professional assassin, but his most cruel act was leaving their 2-year-old daughter Sarah alone with her parents' bodies. The next morning, police discovered Sarah hugging the lifeless bodies of her parents, having spent the night alone with their corpses. This image of innocence destroyed by calculated violence would haunt investigators for years to come. The Basham residence had been known for drug activity, but the cold-blooded nature of these murders stood apart. Forensic reports confirmed both victims were shot at close range in what appeared to be carefully planned executions. In the aftermath, Flannery showed no remorse. He began openly bragging about his violent acts, using the Basham murders to build his fearsome reputation in Sydney's criminal underworld. Each retelling seemed to give him pleasure, especially the details others found most disturbing. The Basham murders marked a turning point for Flannery. He embraced a new level of brutality that made him even more valuable to Sydney's criminal elite. As his reputation for ruthless efficiency grew, so did the price for his services, along with the list of potential clients willing to pay for his particular skills. Imagine a city where hitmen advertise their services like businessmen, where murder has a price tag, and where loyalty changes hands with each new contract. Welcome to 1980s Sydney, where Chris Flannery was about to make his mark as Australia's most notorious gun for hire. The city's underworld was already a powder keg of competing interests and violent turf wars. Different criminal factions fought ruthlessly for control of Sydney's lucrative rackets, from illegal gambling to vice operations. Into this volatile mix stepped Flannery, ready to capitalize on the chaos. He positioned himself as a freelance operator, taking contracts from any crime group willing to meet his price. This unusual business model made him both valuable and dangerous. A gun for hire with no true loyalties. His growing cocaine habit began to shape his actions in dangerous ways. Flannery openly bragged about his murders in underworld hangouts, treating each death like another item on his resume. This reckless behavior marked him as different from the old-school criminals who preferred to operate in shadows. His disregard for traditional criminal hierarchies and police authority reached new heights when he reportedly told a high-ranking police officer, "You're not an endangered species." The threat was clear. In Flannery's world, everyone was a potential target if the price was right. This attitude earned him fear and respect in equal measure, but it also made him increasingly unpredictable. The cocaine-fueled paranoia began affecting his judgment. Where once he'd been calculating and methodical, he now took unnecessary risks. He'd switch allegiances on a whim, working for rival gangs sometimes within the same week. In Sydney's underworld, where loyalty was currency, Flannery's mercenary approach marked him as a wild card that no one could fully trust. As gang wars erupted across Sydney, Flannery found himself in constant demand. Each faction wanted the feared Mr. Rent-a-Kill on their side, but none could be sure he wouldn't work for their enemies tomorrow. He'd become a deadly free agent in a city where taking sides was traditionally how criminals survived. This unusual position made him valuable, but also increasingly isolated. By 1985, both corrupt police and rival gangsters were beginning to see Flannery as a major liability. His cocaine-addled boasting and erratic behavior threatened the delicate balance of power in Sydney's criminal ecosystem. The once disciplined hitman who transformed murder into a business was spiraling into dangerous territory, seemingly blind to the consequences of his actions. Flannery's cocaine-fueled spiral had already made him dangerous, but his next move would shock even Sydney's most hardened criminals. When Detective Michael Drury refused a bribe, Flannery unleashed a violence that would destroy the delicate balance between law and crime. Detective Drury had been investigating a drug case that threatened to expose connections between corrupt police and Sydney's criminal underground. The syndicate, following their usual playbook, sent corrupt officer Roger Rogerson to offer Drury a bribe. But Drury stood firm, refusing the money and setting off a chain of events that would change everything. The syndicate saw Drury's refusal as a direct threat to their operation. They needed someone to handle the situation, and Chris Flannery stepped forward with a solution that would prove catastrophic for everyone involved. On June 6, 1984, as Detective Drury prepared dinner in his kitchen with his 2-year-old daughter nearby, gunshots shattered his kitchen window. The bullet struck Drury, but he survived and identified Flannery as the shooter. This attack on a police officer violated an unspoken rule that even the most ruthless criminals respected. The shooting created a seismic shift in Sydney's underworld. While corruption and bribery were business as usual, attempting to murder a police officer threatened the very system that allowed organized crime to operate. Both law enforcement and criminals recoiled at this breach of their unwritten code. His connection to the shooting through Roger Rogerson exposed the corruption within the police force. When Rogerson was later dismissed for misconduct, Flannery lost his protective shield within law enforcement. Flannery's position became increasingly precarious. To corrupt police officers, he represented a dangerous loose end who knew too much. To the criminal underworld, he was now a liability who had broken their most sacred rule. His paranoid behavior only amplified the danger he posed to both sides. The failed assassination of Detective Drury marked Flannery's point of no return. He had transformed from a valuable asset into a threat that neither criminals nor corrupt police could afford to ignore. His erratic behavior and intimate knowledge of both worlds' secrets sealed his fate in Sydney's underworld. Just months after shooting Detective Drury, Flannery faced a terrifying machine gun attack on his home that would send him spiraling into madness. That January morning, bullets tore through his walls, and though he escaped with his life, his grip on reality began to slip away. The attack pushed him deeper into cocaine addiction, with Flannery consuming the drug up to 20 times daily while battling severe sleep deprivation. Police surveillance teams watched as Australia's most methodical hitman unraveled before their eyes. Flannery stayed awake for weeks at a time, his appearance deteriorating as he bounced between safe houses. The deadly mix of cocaine and exhaustion twisted his mind, convincing him that corrupt police and rival gangsters were closing in from all sides. His fears weren't completely imaginary. As Sydney's premier hitman, Flannery carried dangerous secrets about the criminal underworld and its connections to law enforcement. He made it clear, if anyone tried to take him out, he'd expose everything he knew about the bodies buried across Sydney, both literally and figuratively. In his cocaine-fueled paranoia, Flannery began writing lists of targets, former allies, police officers, and criminal associates he believed were plotting against him. His behavior grew more erratic by the day. Surveillance teams observed him taking random detours, studying reflections, and constantly checking for followers. The criminal underworld watched with alarm as their once reliable killer transformed into an unpredictable threat. His detailed knowledge of corrupt police operations and organized crime made him too dangerous to ignore. Every day brought new signs that Flannery was losing his grip, and by May 1985, both criminals and law enforcement had reached the same conclusion. The man who knew too much had to be silenced. Sydney's most professional hitman had become a target himself. In the underworld, an unstable man armed with explosive secrets can only survive for so long. As Flannery's paranoia reached its peak, the hunter was about to become the hunted. As Flannery's grip on sanity weakened, his body count kept rising. The turning point came with his most shocking murder yet, the assassination of someone who had completely trusted him. This final contract would reveal just how far Flannery had fallen into his deadly spiral. On April 23, 1985, Tony "Spaghetti" Eustace walked out of the airport Hilton in North Arncliffe. 6 bullets tore through his back as he approached his gold Mercedes, a brutal execution of someone Flannery once called friend. 2 schoolchildren discovered Eustace bleeding beside his car, marking another chilling chapter in Sydney's underworld violence. The murder of Eustace sent tremors through Sydney's criminal circles. Flannery had eliminated his closest associate in the Sydney underworld, sending an unmistakable message that shattered what remained of the underground's trust in their most effective killer. Police files attributed at least 15 murders to Flannery, though investigators suspected many more. His deadly efficiency had served Sydney's criminal elite well until now. The same skills that made him valuable had become a liability as his behavior grew more erratic. After killing Eustace, Flannery began threatening to expose everyone's secrets if he faced arrest for shooting Detective Drury. These weren't empty threats. They came from someone who knew the darkest details about Sydney's most powerful criminals. The underworld's response was swift. In hushed meetings across Sydney, crime bosses reached their verdict. Flannery had to be eliminated. The hitman who commanded $50,000 per kill now found himself targeted by his former employers. Flannery sensed the walls closing in. He darted between safe houses, fueled by cocaine and paranoia, compiling an ever-growing list of enemies on both sides of the law. The very skills that had made him Sydney's most feared assassin now made him its most hunted man. As May 9, 1985 approached, Sydney's criminal empire prepared to turn its deadly machinery against its most effective killer. The man known as Mr. Rent-A-Kill was about to face his own brutal methods firsthand. On the morning Chris Flannery vanished, 4 police officers, 1 broken-down car, and a mysterious urgent meeting created the perfect trap. The stage was set for Sydney's most feared hitman to meet his end. The morning of May 9, 1985, began with a phone call from George Freeman. Sydney's most powerful crime boss had an urgent matter to discuss. When Flannery tried to start his car, the engine wouldn't turn over, a mechanical failure that should have triggered his notorious paranoia. He called Freeman to explain, but Freeman insisted he take a taxi. The urgency in Freeman's voice overpowered any suspicion in Flannery's cocaine-addled mind. As he waited outside the Connaught building, 2 police officers he knew pulled up alongside him. They offered him a ride, and despite his recent paranoia about conspiracies against him, Flannery got in. The car moved through Sydney's morning traffic until it stopped at a red light. 2 more police officers appeared and entered the back seat. In an instant, Flannery found himself surrounded. The car pulled away from the traffic light and disappeared into the Sydney morning. Somewhere between that moment and whatever happened next Australia's most notorious hitman vanished forever. The timing was deliberate. Just weeks after threatening to expose corrupt police officers and criminal organizations, after compiling lists of targets, after the murder of his friend Tony Eustace, Flannery had sealed his fate. The criminal empire he had served so efficiently had decided he was too dangerous to keep alive. As that car disappeared into the Sydney traffic, it took with it Chris Flannery and countless underworld secrets that would never see the light of day. No body was ever found. No witness ever came forward. The man who had charged $50,000 per kill had become another missing piece in Sydney's dark criminal puzzle. For 5 years, the disappearance of Australia's most notorious hitman gripped Sydney, launching one of the city's largest criminal investigations. As detectives worked to uncover the truth, they faced a daunting challenge: investigating a murder where every potential witness and suspect was deeply embedded in the criminal underworld. The coronial inquest interviewed over 400 witnesses, but each new testimony only deepened the mystery. Key suspects offered contradicting stories or refused to talk altogether, while others provided accounts that led investigators down endless dead ends. The search for Flannery's body became an obsession, with police scouring properties across Sydney from remote bushland to urban construction sites. But like many of his own victims, Flannery's remains were never found. A breakthrough came from Nettie Smith, a prominent underworld figure who placed Flannery in a police car with officers he knew on the day he vanished. Other witnesses corroborated this crucial detail, adding weight to suspicions about police involvement. The investigation repeatedly returned to crime boss George Freeman's house, where multiple accounts suggested Flannery met his end. But Freeman, like many others connected to the case, died without revealing what he knew. Years later, multiple sources identified Stan Smith as Flannery's likely killer. One professional hitman eliminating another in an operation that left no evidence behind. The coroner ultimately concluded that Flannery was murdered by person or persons unknown on May 9, 1985. Former detective Roger Rogerson held crucial pieces of the puzzle, but maintained his silence, leaving key questions unanswered. The investigation exposed Sydney's intricate criminal network, where the boundaries between law enforcement and organized crime had dissolved. In this shadowy world, even Australia's most feared hitman could vanish without a trace. His disappearance a stark reminder of a system designed to keep its darkest secrets buried forever. Chris Flannery's disappearance marked a decisive moment in Australian organized crime, restoring a delicate balance among rival factions that his unpredictable behavior had threatened to destroy. His elimination removed a major liability, allowing criminal enterprises to operate with reduced internal conflict. Nearly 4 decades later, his body remains unfound, making him the final victim in his own deadly game. The unresolved nature of his case continues to cast a long shadow over Australian criminal history, highlighting the complex relationship between organized crime and law enforcement during the 1980s. His story stands as a dark chapter in Australia's criminal underworld, a ruthless hitman whose violent end matched the brutal world he inhabited.